David Chen, 60, had lived in the same neighborhood for 30 years. He was the kind of neighbor everyone liked, but no one truly knew. Pleasant, quiet, a widower who kept to himself. His only real friend was Robert, 75, who lived across the street. They'd been neighbors since the beginning, had coffee together most mornings, and knew each other's rhythms in the way that people do when proximity breeds familiarity. When Robert suffered a stroke, David visited him in the hospital, drove him to rehabilitation, and eventually helped him settle back into his home. Robert recovered well, but he was weaker than before, more fragile, more dependent on help. David became indispensable. He helped with shopping. He helped with medications. He helped with appointments. He helped so much that Robert's adult children, who lived far away, felt relieved. David was there. Everything was fine, except David had begun to change the terms of their friendship. He started making small suggestions about Robert's life. Your daughter doesn't call as often as she used to, does she? I think she's too busy for you. Your son is always traveling for work. He barely visits. Your grandchildren barely know you. They'll forget you soon enough. Robert, weakened by his stroke, by isolation, by the natural decline of aging, began to believe what David was saying. He felt more abandoned, more alone, more convinced that his family didn't care as much as he'd thought. When Robert's daughter Lisa called one morning, Robert was distant, suspicious. "Why haven't you visited? Are you ashamed of me now?" Lisa was confused. "Dad, I visited last month. I'm coming this weekend." "Don't bother," Robert said coldly. "I know I'm just a burden." Lisa tried to understand what had changed, but Robert wouldn't explain. Every conversation became strained. Every attempt to connect was rebuffed. Eventually, she stopped trying as frequently, worn down by the constant rejection. This was exactly what David wanted. As Robert's family retreated, David became his entire world. David managed his medications, sometimes giving him more than prescribed. David managed his finances, opening accounts in his own name. Temporarily, David managed his social life, discouraging phone calls, limiting visitors. David began making decisions about Robert's healthcare, his living situation, his will. Robert, isolated and dependent, agreed to everything. By the time Robert's daughter Lisa realized something was wrong, her father had already signed over power of attorney to David and changed his will to leave his substantial estate to David instead of to his children. When Lisa confronted David about the financial documents, David smiled sadly and said, "Your father asked me to help him. He doesn't trust you anymore. He told me how disappointed he's been in you." "That's not true." Lisa said, "My father would never, wouldn't he?" But David interrupted, "Look at your phone. How many times this month did you call? How many times did you visit? You're a busy woman with a busy life. Your father knows he's not a priority." David had weaponized Lisa's own guilt, using her legitimate busyness as evidence of her abandonment. But Lisa was smart. She hired an investigator who documented everything. David's systematic isolation of her father, the financial transfers, the medications administered inconsistently, the small lies told repeatedly. She filed a petition to remove David as power of attorney and to declare Robert temporarily unable to make financial decisions due to undue influence. What emerged in the legal proceedings was David's psychology. He had spent his entire life as an invisible man, the neighbor people liked but didn't truly see. He cultivated a specific dynamic, with vulnerable people becoming indispensable precisely so they would depend on him, so he would finally matter. Robert had been David's masterpiece, the perfect victim, isolated, weakened, grateful. But as Lisa dismantled everything David had built, Robert began to see clearly. The moment Robert understood what had happened, something broke inside him. He testified against David, describing how his best friend had systematically convinced him that his own children didn't care about him. He detailed the financial manipulation, the medication irregularities, the calculated isolation. The court removed David from power of attorney and froze his access to Robert's finances. Charges of elder financial abuse and undue influence were filed. But Robert never fully recovered from the betrayal. The stroke had weakened his body, but David had wounded his mind in ways that took far longer to heal. He did eventually rebuild relationships with his children, but he was forever changed. More suspicious, more guarded, never quite sure who was helping him and who was positioning himself to exploit him. David moved away after legal settlements were finalized, disappearing into another city, another neighborhood, where he began the careful work of becoming indispensable to another isolated elderly person. Because that was the truth about David that the legal system couldn't fully address. His exploitation had never really been about money. It had been about finally feeling like he mattered in someone's life, even if that mattering came through calculated manipulation. The most dangerous predators aren't always obvious. Sometimes they're the neighbors who seem helpful, the friends who seem loyal, the people who have learned that dependence can be manufactured and isolation can be weaponized. And sometimes the only way to survive them is to recognize, long before it's too late, that the person making themselves indispensable might be the exact person you should be most careful about.